All right, good morning, everyone. It's just after 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Dondrub, and I facilitate this class. Here we meet every other Saturday from 10 to 11:30. And the structure of this class is that each individual class is self-contained. It's intended to focus on one particular constructive state of mind, and that is sort of universal. So the center, Tupten Norbu Ling, is a Buddhist center. We practice in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. This class is kind of a hybrid in between Tibetan Buddhism and more secular, you know, beneficial, useful ways of thinking and acting in the world. We try to integrate a little bit of both. So, as a class that has this broader focus, we won't talk about things that are uniquely Buddhist, like reincarnation, like karma, enlightenment, things like that. We've got many, many classes at the center that are very Buddhist, but this is a bit broader in its scope. So the values or the constructive states of mind are universal, just in terms of wanting to develop these good qualities for oneself in terms of one's relationships, one's place in the world, etc. But we do integrate some aspects, of Buddhism as well to give people a little bit of a well-rounded, it's hard for me not to do that entirely. It's hard for me to completely, because that's my only training is in Buddhist philosophy. I don't have any training in secular, sort of. The values themselves, the constructive states of mind, as I say, they're not uniquely Buddhist. There are such things, but we don't bring them in this particular course. But I do try to make some connections, some relations to how things also fit into a Buddhist context, if that's of interest or if that's something that you might want to explore as well. So these classes have all been recorded on our YouTube channel, which you can get to from tnlsf.org, the homepage there, the upper left or upper right, you can says go to the YouTube channel. You can find these past classes. As I say, they're all self-contained. So, having attended the class on contentment or the class on kindness doesn't necessarily, help you with any individual class. They're all individual, self-contained, constructive states of mind. So, I mean, in a way, just the concept of the class is somewhat Buddhist because we are talking about in these classes what I'm calling states of mind. Um, and oftentimes people think of them as either just personality traits or behaviors. Um, and the Buddhist perspective very much looks at these states of mind as things that we can choose to train in, we can choose to cultivate, we can choose to develop over longer time scales. It's not none of these things. These are all lifelong trainings. These are all lifelong pursuits, growing in our sense of contentment, kindness, humility. Those are some of the past topics that we've done. I believe this is class 7 um, in this larger series. So, I mean, just as a perspective, in the Western world, we don't really think in that way. We don't really think that um, Today's topic is honesty. So we don't necessarily, of course, generally speaking, we understand that there's value in being honest, um, but we don't necessarily think of it as a lifelong pursuit, a lifelong training, that there are things that I can reflect on, that there's ways of watching my mind in daily life to um, turn away from tendencies and habits that I might have accumulated where, little white lies or little, kinds of ways of wanting to be seen in a particular way, wanting to present oneself in a particular way that isn't necessarily fully authentic, fully, we might want to be seen as not having any faults. Now, as these are common, normal ways of just being human, being, it's not abnormal, that we might go into certain social situations and present things in a very, um, in a light that is very wanting to use the phrase self-serving, which is maybe a little bit harsh, but in a way that reflects really well on oneself, that maybe isn't in alignment with what's necessarily true, or to want to get something in a particular situation and to accomplish that in a way that isn't entirely forthright. Um, these are all tendencies and habits that, as ordinary people, we've developed and that we struggle with. Um, but we can move in a different direction gradually over time. We can embody these positive qualities more and more. Um, and so the whole approach to this class is taking that perspective, taking the perspective that these are not just static personality traits, like, oh, that's a kind. Oh, what did I? That's very fair. Okay, so that's kind of the philosophical premise of why we're offering this class, is so that we can give people some tools, some techniques, some processes for um, growing in their ability to embody these qualities over the course of the rest of their lives. And so one aspect of that is that on the event page on the website that you've all seen, at the very bottom, there's a link called course materials. And we have sort of integration practices that you're welcome to work with for each class. So as I said, the past ones are recorded, and there's one for today that's there. So between now and 2 weeks from now, there's a sort of a workbook that you can use if you want to. So, with honesty, honesty does relate specifically or in a way to the Buddhist path, Tibetan Buddhist path, because uh, you've probably all heard of the five lay vows or the five training precepts. You may have I know that I heard about it first in like seventh grade, you know, world religions class. You find the five training precepts. Technically, they're only intended for a person who is Buddhist, right? Um, but in a way, so the five lay vows are to avoid killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, and intoxicants. Uh, and so honesty, of course, is the opposite of lying, right? Lying is a deceitfulness, and honesty would be the antidote to this tendency of being deceitful, or this tendency of, in some ways trying to manipulate situations through not being fully forthright. So, even though, of course, as a training that's only meant for people who have decided to become Buddhist, and a person can spend their whole lives just integrating parts of Buddhism that seem useful. That's perfectly valid without ever having become Buddhist, what's called going for refuge, becoming Buddhist. But in a way, because the Buddha included it in the five lay vows, it's a statement of how important it is to a spiritual life, to an ethical life, um, in the sense that it's in the foundational ethical teachings of the Buddha. And also, another aspect of this that I think is relevant is that it's one of the five vows. And the Buddha also talked about other ethical um, exhortations, like, for example, to avoid harsh speech or to avoid idle speech. But those are not vows, right? A lay Buddhist has a vow not to lie. They don't have a vow not to use harsh speech, although the Buddha says, we should really try to not speak harshly to other people, not to use your words to wound other people. Um, but that is more subtle, right? It's very difficult to go the next 40 years never raising your voice in anger. But the vows, these five vows, are coarser, right? The Buddha is saying you can actually make a determination to never lie again, to never, intentionally mislead other people for the rest of your life. That's a coarser, misdeed or unethical action. And so, as such, it's possible to actually refrain from that forever, um, which gives it a particular place in the teachings on ethics within Buddhism. Um, so, in that sense, it's reasonable to think that we can make a determination to be forthright, to be honest, to avoid manipulating, to avoid, misleading other people. And one thing that we've talked about as a through line, in this course is that I've used the phrase constructive state of mind, right? Honesty is the constructive state of mind, the beneficial state of mind that we're trying to cultivate. Its opposite would be a deceitful, mind. That would be what I would call a destructive state of mind, constructive and destructive. Destructive in the sense that so these words come from Buddhism, and they refer to different types of states of mind, and we can identify these states of mind on the basis of whether in one's own mind they facilitate a sense of ease, a sense of peace, a sense of openness, a sense of connection. Those are constructive states of mind. They support in our own mind, in our own lives, um, joyfulness, connection, openness, um, and destructive states of mind rob us in the moment as they are arising of those beneficial effects, right? When we are deceiving other people, we don't feel good about it. Like, we regret it later, maybe, hopefully we see it as something like, oh, I wish I hadn't. Like, in that moment, maybe we're afraid of our reputation being tarnished, right? Because they ask us a question or they accuse us of, like, they saw or they suspected that maybe we acted in a way that isn't great, and they kind of call us out on it, and we're like, no, I didn't do that. I didn't take that stapler from work that maybe you thought I did, or I didn't say that, I didn't speak badly about that person that you maybe thought you overheard, or someone said, like, no, of course I would never, because we're attached to being seen, um, in a particular way. So we deny, or we lie, we lie about the action that we engaged in. Or they ask us, have you ever stolen anything from a store or, whatnot? And probably we've all taken, like, in our 20s, I did when I was 18, 19, 20, in college, we called it the free food aisle, the bulk bins, in the grocery store. I took them out that first year because we all called it the free food aisle. Um, so, you took a piece of candy, you took a piece of gum, from the bins, and that's stealing, right? That's not good. Um, but that's if someone said, would you ever act? No, of course I would never. When you know that that's something that you did do, like in your past. Um, but we want to be seen as someone who wouldn't do that, and so we might not be fully honest with other people. Um, and we know that when we aren't being honest with other people, we feel disconnected. We feel like, and when we get called on, if it becomes known that we've misled other people, then we become known as not trustworthy, right? Other people feel like they can't rely on us, that they can't, that we might, we are someone who lies. We are someone who misleads, which makes us not trustworthy in our relationships with other people, and that is destructive. And of course, so that's the first way that these states of mind are constructive or destructive, is in terms of one's own subjective experience. They're either painful when they arise in the mind, or they facilitate openness and dialogue and receptivity and joy in the mind. Because if we can just be open and honest with people, then people have nothing, then we become trustworthy, and we become, we're not trying to think about, in every situation, how do I be seen in a particular way? We're just ourselves. We just tell people what's true. And then we want to act in ways that allow us to not feel like there is something to hide. Like we start to um, become more ethical in our actions, so that we don't feel the need to manipulate other people's views. And that also feels really good. That also, like, we're dealing honestly with people, we're dealing, appropriately. And that's also this really constructive, useful state of mind. Um, so we're the primary beneficiaries of training in constructive states of mind, but also we harm other people when we act, when destructive states of mind are operating, when, because people don't lie, people, and if you look at the other states of mind that we've already covered, what they have in common, as I was saying, this through line through all of the classes, is that the destructive states of mind are motivated by these, well, destructive actions, like actually being deceitful. It's motivated by, these strong attachments to our reputation, to wanting to get things from other people, wanting to, manipulate situations to have them work out as we would prefer them to work out. Um, and that is harmful to other people as well, because that is what is right. We don't lie when there's strong love and kindness that's arising in our mind. We don't lie when there's strong compassion arising in our mind. We lie when there's, kind of when there's, a very strong desire to just get something for oneself, to just, like, I need other people to see me in a particular way. And that's kind of also exhausting, to maintain this false, like, way of being with other people. And then again, as I said, so we're trying to, we feel as though if we told people the truth, then things wouldn't be how we would want them to be. And so we have to lie in order to get what we want out of that situation. We might lie to get things from other people, or to cause them to think of us in a particular way. And that's harmful also to the other people as we're doing it, as we're misleading them. We're not allowing them to navigate the world based on what's true. They're making decisions, they're making choices based on what's this false narrative that we're presenting to them. And that's very detrimental in our relationships and our friendships, you know, not dealing with people honestly and openly is also really painful, not only in one's own mind as it's arising, but it destroys really the trustworthiness in our relationships and separates us from other people, which is also really destructive for them. They see us as not honest, and they see us as the source. We become the source of other people's, you know, painful experiences when we manipulate them and we lie to them. Um, so now, of course, and one of the discussion questions, so in a little bit, this is what we kind of do here is the first little bit, we sort of introduce the topic, and then we do a small group discussion on the topic, and then we end with a closing meditation on the topic. So this is the introductory part. Um, but one aspect of this, of course, that is also acknowledged in Buddhism and should just be acknowledged in a more secular context as well, is that this is in it, many of these are not always black or white, right? They're not. Um, we can't have a uncritical or unthinking devotion to always saying, because to be dishonest is to say something to someone that you know not to be the truth, right? If you yourself don't know that it's not the truth, if you yourself have a misunderstanding and you communicate a misunderstanding, that's not a lie. You're not being dishonest. You're just not, you yourself don't know what's true. But when we do know what's true and we say the opposite of that to someone, that's what we're talking about in terms of dishonesty. But there are times in our lives when there are complicated situations, right? We might um, have a good faith belief that one person intends to cause harm to another person, to an animal, to bring about some destructive action in the world. And they might ask us, do you know where I can find such and such a person? Or they might say, do you know where's good fishing, or where's good hunting? Or you might be in the woods and there might be a hunter, and this deer might have run, past you, and they're like, well, which way did the deer go? Which and like you saw the deer went that way, but you also know that person wants to kill that deer, or that person wants to harm this other person that they're in a toxic relationship with, and you might know that that person is in a shelter or they're with a friend. Um, so we probably shouldn't tell the truth in those situations, right? We shouldn't say, well, yeah, that person is staying with this person. This is their address. This is how you get there. This is the best way. This is the quickest route, to that house. That would be unskillful, right? To tell the truth if we know that telling the truth is going to cause some great harm to some other person or even an animal. Like, we should try, there are greater considerations like protecting life, taking care of other people, and from the Buddhist perspective, animals as well. We shouldn't just tell the truth in every situation if we know that we're facilitating harm by doing it. So we have to use our judgment. We have to use our own best judgment in deciding, you know, what is skillful or unskillful. There's no like absolute black or white in these ethical dilemmas that we face. Um, okay, so that is kind of an introduction to this idea of training the mind in honesty, training the mind in forthrightness. Um, Are there any questions or thoughts or considerations that have arisen?
Because it's a lot and convincing. So, and later, and there was a repentance.
Mhm. I'm sorry, your question was, I didn't follow. Oh, I see. I see. I see. So yes, so there is in this topic, in the material for this topic, and this is also true for this approach that is part of this topic. Well, really, it's part of any um, any way of relating to an unskillful or destructive action, because really Buddhism tries to use that, the phrasing of um, as I said, constructive, destructive, skillful, unskillful, rather than talking about right or wrong or, good or bad, things like that. Um, so the first step in terms of growing in any of these constructive states is that we have to have clarity in our own mind about what is, as you said, we can mislead ourselves about what is, did I lie? Is it really a lie? Is it not really a lie? So Buddhism really emphasizes introspective awareness and um, checking one's own motivation. So, as I mentioned, we can distinguish between a constructive and a destructive action based on what's actually happening in our own mind at the time, right? So, but this, of course, as with all of these trainings, it's a lifelong process of becoming more and more conscious of what is, because what's developing consciousness or introspective awareness of one's own motivations is very difficult. Buddhism is extremely difficult. It doesn't just say, well, worship this or honor, propitiate this or, act in this outward way, just do this outward action. What it really emphasizes is what's happening in the mind, what is actually genuinely motivating our actions. So, as I mentioned, when loving kindness, when compassion, when generosity, when patience, when ethical restraint, when all of these constructive states of mind are really strongly present in the mind, we're not going to act in ways that cause harm to others, right? We're going to act in beneficial ways, naturally, spontaneously. And so when we mislead people, as we've been, discussing, it's because something is happening in the mind where there is a very ego-driven motivation, where the motivation isn't love or compassion or generosity. The motivation is self-centered, egotistical. We we want to extract from the situation rather than to add to the situation. So if we can check over time what's happening in my mind, like I'm about to say this thing, um, why am I saying it? Am I trying to cause the other person to do something, to think something, to act in a particular way that they wouldn't say or do or act if they knew something other, if I was telling them what was true, like if I was just telling them what happened or what was accurate or what was to the best of my ability. Um, so that's the most important step, is to actually think about, before we say or do things, why it is that we're saying or doing them, and getting better and better at it. And then, but as I said, these states of mind, from the Buddhist perspective, another aspect of this idea of being able to train in these states of mind is to say that we actually do have control over what's happening in the mind. And that's also something that's not really part of our culture, right? We think that emotions and thoughts, and that because they're so strong and they're so immediate and they're so, like, we get scared, right? When someone, we in that moment, it isn't that we're a terrible person, but we just react kind of instinctively, because we think, oh no, if they knew this, then they would criticize me, or then they would do this or that. And so that ego grasping that arises so strongly, it feels, so powerful and so strong and so immediate, that we just say the thing, we just do the thing right then. And that can certainly happen, and that will happen, and that does happen. That is happening. So we may, as you said, only later be able to really reflect, like, oh, I wish, like in that moment, I felt like I didn't want to, I was really nervous about saying or doing the truthful thing. So I kind of fudged in the moment. So then we regret, right? So the step in terms of what you're talking about, to the best of our ability, if we can understand, like, okay, I didn't act according to the highest, best principle in the moment. So later, at least later, I regret. I regret having, engaged in that process. I regret that I did, in that moment, I felt like I couldn't do anything else. The, the what arose in my mind was so overpowering, that it just came out wrong, or I just did an unskillful action. So we can interrupt the what we don't want to do is think, that's what I should have done. Like, oh, I'm glad I deceived them. That's kind of adding fuel to this process. We can interrupt that process by regretting it at any point later, thinking, I really shouldn't have done that. I really shouldn't. And then maybe, if possible, we go back to that person and we say, I I didn't really present this in the best way. What I should have said is this, and I'm sorry that in that moment, I didn't do that. If we can't bring ourselves to do that, at least in meditation, perhaps, we can imagine, in a similar situation, what is a better way of responding? What is, if that happens again, and you can kind of replay it in your mind, like, you were going along and the person came up to you and they said what they said, you said what you said. And this also goes back to introspective awareness, right? This is a way of developing introspective awareness, because it's difficult, as I said, because it in the when we're in daily life and the things are happening, there's so much going on in our environment, that actually keeping track of what's arising in the mind with all of the stimuli that's occurring, very difficult. But in meditation, the stakes are much lower, right? There's nobody actually there. You're just remembering this thing that happened. So you have an opportunity to go back to before it happened, and then watch the mind as it moves into the lie, as it moves into, and if you do that, like, every day, with these, and we can do this with lots of things: being unkind, being rude, being arrogant, being all, any of these things that we wish we hadn't done. This is a tool that we can use. Later on, we can watch the mind when things are quiet, when we're on our own, we're just, on the cushion, or in a chair, like we're just meditating on our own. And we can watch the mind as it moved into the destructive state of mind. We can say, oh, okay, this is what it felt like in the mind when the impulse to be dishonest, when it arose. And and then we have knowledge, we have insight. Okay, next time, that's what it's going to feel like next time. It's going to feel similar when that impulse to protect my ego, my reputation, my status, my wealth, when that impulse arises, it's going to have that same type, feeling in the body, in the mind. And so I can notice, I have knowledge now, I have insight now that I can use, maybe, hopefully, maybe not the very next time, but over months of engaging in this process, um, we can learn to recognize what moving into these destructive states of mind, what thoughts arise, what feelings arise, what bodily sensations arise, and then we can interrupt that faster and faster. As I mentioned, regret is interrupting it after the fact, and that's really good. That's important. But we want to get to a place where we interrupt it, you know, hopefully before it happens, and then eventually from this perspective, because from the Buddhist perspective, we actually can get to a place where we have mastery over the mind, where, you know, it isn't true from the Buddhist perspective that we are, entirely subject to emotions and thoughts and feelings that are just beyond our control. They're certainly beyond our control today, but that doesn't mean that they have to be. The Buddhist perspective is that the mind is incredibly powerful and that we can gain control over the things that we think and our emotional responses. But it just takes years of dedication and years of practice. Um, so, so that is regret. And then we have this idea of, so then we want to have um, something that we rely on. So the first step is regret, and then we want to have something that we rely on. So, and this can take different forms, but you can think about, as I said, you can think about your own intrinsic ability to um, grow, like your own, they call this, well, it depends on how you want to think about it, but from the Buddhist perspective, Buddhism would assert that we have what's called Buddha nature, Buddha potential, right? The ability, as I said, this ability that the mind isn't fixed, that the mind is flexible, the mind is trainable, that although these afflicted, we haven't used that phrase in this class, but destructive states of mind or afflicted states of mind, unskillful states of mind, um, they, they are present in our experience, but they don't have to be present in our experience. We can move beyond them. We can train the mind. So our own fundamental goodness, you could say our own basic goodness, you can rely on that. You can think, well, that's my actual nature, is fundamental goodness, not this impulse that sometimes arises when my ego feels threatened. Like that's true in my experience, but it's not at the core of my mind. It's not at the core of my identity. At the core is basic goodness. And so you can focus on that and think that if I rely on that, then I can use that to reduce. Then the third thing is some sort of remedial action. Um, and this can be, as I said, going to that person, trying to, and you use the phrase making amends. And so, of course, what's out of our control is how the other person's going to respond. When we deceive someone, we harm them, and we we lose some trust with them, and we have no control over whether they choose to trust us ever again. Right? They may never. Right? We may lie to them in a way and they may that's their choice, right? We can try to demonstrate, forthrightness from then on, um, but we may never gain their trust again, but we can't control that. Um, but from our side, we can apologize. We can say, I'm really sorry. I will do my very best to never engage in this kind of behavior ever again. Um, so making amends doesn't depend upon their accepting of our apology or we don't have any control over that. But we do have control over whether we see it as negative, whether we regret it, whether we make a strong determination in the mind not to engage in it again and again and again, not to see it as a useful way. Some people in the world see lying as a really useful way to get what they want, right? They just do it all the time. They see it as a way of being in the world that helps them get what they want. We don't want to be like that. We don't want to see it in that way. We want to see it as negative. We want to see it as an impulse that is related to our ego grasping, our, clinging to our property, our status, our wealth, our reputation, um, and and to see it as something to overcome and to work toward overcoming it. Um, and so then we, and then so then we should feel we should feel like instead of rejoicing in at the end of this process, instead of rejoicing that we did this negative action, we should feel, a sense of joy that we've tried to do something about it, that we've tried to, because that will help sort of magnetize the mind the things that we rejoice in are the things that we grow. Right. So if we rejoice in like, oh, aha, I got one over on that person. They thought I misled them and I succeeded. They gave me this thing. Like that was cool. Like I got away with it and I got what I wanted. We rejoice in a negative action. We're going to grow engaging in negativity. But if we think, oh, if we're really happy about catching ourselves and we're really happy that we apologized and we think, oh, it's really appropriate that I confessed that negativity, that I engaged in some meditation to overcome that. And we feel really like that was the appropriate thing to do. Then we get magnetized in that direction, which is part of this lifelong, slow process of becoming more honest, over the next 20, 30, 50 years, however long we're lucky to be alive, we can grow by thinking how wonderful it is that I I didn't energize, I didn't, um, you know, um, just empower those not so great impulses. Um, so this is a psychological process that mirrors just again as information from the Buddhist perspective, if you have an interest, it mirrors what's called purification practice, um, purifying negativities. The our own present familiarity or habit or impulse of dishonesty is an impure. I mean, in English, it's kind of a heavy, I think just because we have a Judeo-Christian cultural background, these words that people have decided to pick, to represent these concepts, maybe not so great, but you know, it, it is an impulse that is currently in our minds. And as I mentioned, it is painful for oneself and it causes harm to others. So if we can bring ourselves to think of that like as an impurity in the mind, you could think of it as something that covers that basic goodness that I mentioned, right? It's not in the nature of our mind. The nature of our mind is basic goodness, but the impulse is getting in the way. It's like a cloud in the sky, or a stain, or an impurity, however you want to think about it. Um, and getting rid of those impulses is purification practice, is moving the mind away from identifying with these stains, these impulses, these that are not so great, and uniting the mind with its essential nature, its basic goodness. So, just to say, uh, that psychological process is very similar to what you do in Buddhist purification practice, although there's typically like an enlightened being that is involved in the visualization. We do it here at the center Monday through Friday. It's called Vajrasattva practice. Vajrasattva is the enlightened being that's connected to purifying negativities. It's from 9 to 9:30 Monday through Friday, or just on Zoom, not here at the center. So if that's of any interest, it is something that we offer. Just to just to say that that is a thing, and it's an important part of historical Tibetan Buddhist practice. But we've also described it now also in a more secular context as well. You can do a very similar thing without, Vajrasattva and visualization. You can do it in this more secular format that we've discussed a little bit. And as I mentioned, you can do it with any of the negativities when you are unkind, when you are um, arrogant, or when you're any of these other negativities, ways of thinking or acting in the world that are not in that are not so great. You can go through these steps of regret, of these different steps that we've talked about. Okay. Anything else? Anything else? Okay, so let's move into the this small group discussion portion of the class. So it was just the four of you here. Gonna get into a group, and I will put it on the screen if I can figure out how to do that. We'll see if I'm prepared. Yeah, just any kind of a small group. Again, going back to how we can identify constructive and destructive states of mind, we can identify, and of course, this idea of introspective awareness and all of this, genuine kindness can be identified by the wish do I genuinely have the wish for the other person to be happy and for them to be free of suffering? Is that genuinely in my mind? Or do I just want to avoid discomfort? Do I just want to avoid, having maybe them thinking, like, if I say something that out of a genuine desire for them to be happy and to be free of suffering, you might say something that causes them to confront something that they might, but your motivation, if they don't confront it and if they don't make a change, then you're not, is that really kind? Saying we think, oh, I'm sparing their feelings because in the moment it can be uncomfortable to be like, hey, maybe do this differently or do that differently, or, so that something goes well, something is, because ultimately they'll benefit from that, but that exchange can require a certain courageousness, a certain, willingness to have a difficult conversation, and we may shy away from that. And so here, the word that was kindness isn't really kindness, because kindness, I don't think that genuine kindness could ever necessarily involve, except for um, those situations that we talked about where you may have to actually lie in order to protect like life or property, or then that is kindness that is motivated by a true untruth. But in general, you know, the things that we think that we're being kind, but ultimately also we're being untruthful, because the kind thing is the truthful thing that's uncomfortable, that's difficult to actually be the conversation that we have. But of course, sometimes we do actually have to be deceptive in order to serve a higher purpose of saying, well, I'm not going to tell you how to find the person that you would like to kill, or that you are in a dispute with, or that, how someone says, how can I cheat on my taxes? Like how do I get I don't want to pay this, tell me how do I, and like you're an accountant and you could be like, well, if you establish this fake company over here and it's not really ethical, but you'd be like, no, I'm not gonna do that. I'm going to we may have certain expertise in certain areas that might help people do unethical things, and um, that's not kind, that's not being kind, is actually helping them avoid like the legal ramifications that could come. They're just thinking about how do I reduce my tax bill, or how do I, in the moment, we're thinking about this long-term benefit that we want them to have. Um, okay, so this is now the meditation that we close with. So just sit comfortably with an upright spine. So think about keeping your feet flat and your back straight, torso open, hands in the lap, right over left, with the palms upturned and the thumbs gently touching. Just begin to move the mind away from the outside world, letting go of thoughts of the past, plans for the future, concentrating your awareness in the present by attending closely to the physical sensation of the air as it moves into and back out of the tip of the nostrils. Giving yourself the instruction to notice quickly when anything other than that one physical sensation is arising in the mind, and then, without judgment or frustration, to lift your awareness up from those distractions and to place it gently but firmly again and again on the breath. And then bring to mind a time when you yourself were on the receiving end of dishonesty. How did it feel? What lasting impressions, consequences did it have on your behavior, your outlook, your relationship? And that brings to mind an action that you yourself engaged in, where you weren't fully honest with someone, something not too emotionally charged. Begin by generating a sense of regret. Regret is different than guilt. Regret is a recognition that that action is not in alignment with one's values, whereas guilt is a view that oneself is a bad person. Try to see it as not being in alignment. And just wish that it hadn't happened. And then generate a sense of strength, inspiration from your own basic goodness. Recognizing that this impulse is not intrinsic to oneself, simply a habit, an impulse. There's a deeper, basic goodness in the mind that we can draw strength from. And then think of a remedial action that you can engage in to replace that destructive impulse. Perhaps apologizing, making a small donation to a worthy cause, offering your time to bring about some good in the world. To help someone in need. Generate a new constructive habit. Be resolved to engage in a constructive action. And then give rise to a commitment, a determination that at least for the rest of today, I will watch my mind. I will notice the impulse to be dishonest. If it arises, I will restrain. I'll do my very best to be honest and forthright. Since it's not possible to make that strong promise forever, make it for a reasonable amount of time, like the rest of today. To apply special effort. And connect with a sense of joy in the mind that one has taken these constructive steps, not to just simply follow old habits, old impulses, but that one is forging a new path. One is committed to growing in honesty, reducing that impulse. And then when you're ready, we'll come back together. All right, we're just out of time for today's class. Are there any final thoughts or questions? Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. So there's idle, I may have said idle speech. Yeah. Yeah. So there's the five lay vows, and they're vows, as I mentioned, because the Buddha considered them, coarse enough, meaning the opposite of subtle, coarse enough that a person could choose if they were 20, they could say, I mean, of course, just because a person who's 20 goes for refuge, they say, I mean, they're going to live for 60 more years, but they're going to probably tell another lie. But it's at least as an abstract idea, it's reasonable to say, I can watch my mind and I can prevent myself from being, misleading to other people. Whereas it's so much more difficult to say I won't raise my voice in anger with, and call someone a name or, be rude, say you're an idiot, how dare you? Why, you know, that is so much more difficult. But it didn't say, I mean, so there's also the 10 non-virtuous actions, which is a different ethical teaching that the Buddha gave. So the 10 non-virtuous actions where, you've got other things, they're also important, but they're not vows. They're not things that so idle speech, the definition, of course, is in the class. We have a class on Buddhism in a nutshell, which is coming up. Maybe, is it next? What month are we in? Or not? I think it's in December. Or no, it's in January. December is Meditation 101. Yeah, this January, where we go over all of these things. Tuesday nights. Um, But so idle speech is basically the technical definition is to talk about just meaningless things, to kind of just waste people's time by going on and on and on about just like meaningless topics. Um, so it's very, and of course, it's difficult to like never do, which is again why it's not a vow. It's one of the 10 non-virtuous actions, because we do a lot of idle speech, but like gossip is a particularly pernicious form of idle speech where you're talking about other people behind their backs. Like, did you hear about what this person did? Or that would be idle speech. That would be a particularly, but technically it means to just waste people's time by just talking about total nonsense, like just popular culture and sports. And of course, we do some of that, but we should try to watch our speech and make our speech kind of meaningful as much as we can and not just like encourage people to really get super invested in just supermodels and different kinds of, sports and things that are happening in the world, like did you fashion and silly topics that, that are happening and that we should try to restrain as much as we can. That's what idle speech is. Okay. So yeah, so yes, we meet again. Geshe teaches tomorrow on um, mind transformation on Lohsang. He teaches tomorrow, 10 to 11:30. Our resident teacher, Geshe Sherab. Um, yeah, and we meet again in 2 weeks.